Anybody out there for public comment? No? Guess not. All right. Then let's proceed. And it's going to be a presentation discussion led by Barrett Planning Group and Union Studio Architecture and Community Design. So you guys, it's up to you. Go ahead. Alexis, are you doing it? Or Elizabeth, you are?
Yeah, I'll be leading, but we'll have
Okay.
different kind of guest stars popping in. But before I share my screen, I would just note we have Brett, if you want to wave Brett, and Jeremy here today to add their expertise to the conversation. So I think we'll really quickly go through the site report or like the high level takeaways from the site report and discuss that. Then we'll talk about what we've heard from community engagement so far. Alexis will talk about that. Then we'd like to talk with the committee about what the committee's decision-making criteria will be for kind of how you proceed. And then we'll talk a little bit about possible scenarios. And Jeremy made up a really wonderful matrix to help us kind of start to have a conversation around that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the committee and Jeremy think is best for the community meeting we have scheduled on the 11th, which is framed as design thinking. And just so we'll manage our time appropriately, John, what should we be aiming for the end time for this meeting, 7 or 7:30?
7 o'clock. I think that would be.
All right.
Okay. Is that, will that, you can.
We'll find out.
Okay.
I'll try to manage our time. Like
right.
I wrote in our schedule kind of times that should get us to 7. There's a chance we go over. We have a lot to cover.
All right, if we do. I think this is a very important meeting, what we're going to do. So,
Yeah.
But let's try and make it 7.
And one thing before I start, just for the committee to have in mind, as Jeremy and Brett and Judy and Alexis and I were talking today, what we'll present to the committee today is also what we think we'd probably want to walk the community through as we move towards design thinking. So think of this, as your committee meeting, but a little bit of a test run too, that we'd want to be sharing these same thoughts and findings with the public. Okay. So let me get this started and see if I can share the right window. Okay. All right. How's that look? Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I already went through this. These are the topics we'll be aiming to cover today. And just a reminder of where we are in the planning process. So we're kind of in the second bullet. So we're aiming for that second community meeting, and our team will be working on a technical memorandum around housing needs, market analytics, and site suitability. So that's where we are. And so I'll go over a high level. George distributed the site report, so there's a lot more detail in that, but these are just some high level takeaways. And I think you all know where the site for your committee is, but there it is. And you know that it's an old motel, about 5.5 acres with 450 feet of frontage. One of the you'll see later at the end, one of the biggest constraints that will drive some of the design and what's possible on the site is the topography. And so I didn't label this, but where the lines are closest together is where they're the drop-offs are the steepest. So on the left side of your screen, you can kind of see there are sort of 2 ridges, and then there's a big grade change if you look from the main in-building, like the very center, to the top right corner of this screen. It's about 45 feet change in elevation. The site is in the midst of multiple uses, which means that a lot of different things could be contextually appropriate in this location. And so the different colors on this map, the different building colors, those are different land uses. And so you can see it's really in a mixture, neighborhood that has a mixture of uses. I think we talked about this in the community meeting, but it has great access to a lot of amenities in Orleans, a lot of which were mapped as part of Orleans' economic development plan. And so the Clip Notes version, the summary of the report is that it's a great opportunity for this site for housing because it is centrally located. It's very accessible to all those amenities I just mentioned. This site represents an opportunity to address housing needs, which there's great need of on the Cape, but there's also opportunities to further economic development, climate resilience, and other planning efforts. The big constraint is topography for a number of different reasons. Putting buildings in different places than they are today will require earthwork, and that can have cost implications, that can have implications for preserving trees on the site. As you begin to add uses that need driveways or parking, circulation becomes an issue and emergency access. You're going to see different building types based on that topography too. So you walk in the front and you walk out one level further down out the back. And also the topography has an impact on drainage and how you site drainage systems on the site, so you're not flooding neighbors. And one of the constraints, so I talked about it's a site that's suitable for many uses, but that's kind of a constraint. It's hard to choose what makes sense in that location. And then also in the site report, Jeremy kind of did a diagnostic of where it stands in terms of current zoning. So those are all things that we want to be mindful of as we move forward with our work. But I don't know if anyone read the site report and had any questions.
Yeah, I have a question if I could.
Yeah.
This is George. I've been mulling over this topography, and I think the 45-foot grade change, I know it's physically, you can count them, but I'm not sure that most of the site is affected that much by it. And, we're in a sandy environment. You start doing earthwork and it's really just a machine pushing sand around for the most part. I know there'll be some glacial erratics. There's probably a huge one somewhere on that site based on some of the stuff that's there. But I just, just as a thought, I wonder whether topography really is a limiting factor or if it's just something we can work with pretty easily, given the, the expected development and, some cost of 8 figures likely if it's a housing project. That's it.
I think Jeremy's probably best equipped to speak
Yeah.
to that.
I mean, if the site were flat, I would say it'd be a much easier prospect. And so I feel like just making that statement suggests the amount of grade we're dealing with is in a way a constraint, right? There are limitations, there are things, it's not to say it's a problem, it's just to say it's a constraint. It's something you have to work around, it's something you have to consider. It's going to motivate and drive certain decisions. We can't do sort of, anything we'd want, I mean, you can never do anything, just anything you want, but it's significant enough here that it is a true front page concern, right? It's not sort of one of the last things we'll think about. It's probably one of the first things we'll think about. So in that sense, I think that's why we were considering it a constraint.
Could I just, Elizabeth, I think the topography makes it an especially beautiful piece of property. And something that really can be an asset to it. I know it creates difficulties, but I think it's a challenge. But I think it's so nice to have something like this where we can maybe use some real vision and do something really special or more special than just a flat thing. And the other thing is that Alan McLennan, who was Fran's husband and very active in town, pointed out at the end of our session that this is, I forget, it's glacially formed or something like that. We don't want to bulldoze it to flatness, I don't think, but I leave that up to the expert. But I don't think topography, I think it causes some challenges, but I think it adds to the beauty of the site. So.
Definitely. And I think we frame it as constraints, as what has to be the front of mind when you design. That's not to say it's a bad thing. Like, it is what it is. This is the land that the glaciers formed, and we're going to have to work with it. But I think it's just, if someone says, can you build 300 dog houses for like lack of a better example, you have to lay them out in a certain way. And when there's a slope, the different greenhouses or something are going to have to be laid out in a different way. That's all we mean when we say constraints, that it affects how you do design. And Tina, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to concur with John. One of the spectacular attributes of this property is, number one, its height. It has water views. And I assume that the constraint would be monetary. So when I look at a site like that, and you're going to develop it, we're not gonna just take the buildings and replace them where they are. It would be more expensive, and that does need to be top of mind, especially when I look at drainage. So, but I wanted to concur with John. I think that the beauty of the site is the topography. So thank you.
Definitely. Well, thanks everyone for those comments. And, I think we agree with the beauty of the site, and it's kind of peaked at the top of the hill there in Orleans. So we definitely don't mean to imply that it's a negative, the topography, but just a
Just
constraint.
one other hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Mark,
Yeah, my apologies. I'm on the road and I was just trying to make sure I could get in. And just as, I think no matter what we consider for the site, whether it's housing or something else, the topography is the topography. It's an issue that needs to be dealt with no matter what. And I think as we look at potential developers of the site, they're all going to be looking at it and looking at all the pluses and minuses of it, and in the ways that we can use those elevations to maybe have multi-level buildings on that backside if we have access there, whatever it might be. So that's the topography is going to be an issue no matter what's there. The one other thing that I was, not to be negative about it, but I don't want us to get hung up on the fact that, this is a site that has some glacial erratics and some, very old trees. Every place on Cape Cod has that. And, we can be mindful of it, but we can't let that dictate, what happens here. We can work around some of those things depending on what we develop there, but we're looking at the best interests of the town of Orleans for this site. And if the best interest is, housing or a community center or whatever it might be, versus maintaining some huge boulder, what's in the best interest of the town? So, as I said, just the site is what it is. No matter what gets developed there, we're going to have to deal with it. And I don't think that can be the dictate of what goes there. We need to look at what's best for the town at this point in time and work around whatever the site presents us with. And so I just don't want that to become a focal point of our discussions.
Thanks, Mark. And I think you're previewing what we'll talk about later, which is what the decision making criteria would be for the scenarios. So I'm just going to move us forward just to try and get us out by 7 and have Alexis give us the summary of the community engagement. And then we'll loop back to kind of how we weight things a little bit later in our conversation. So let me see if I'm on the right slide. Okay, so we have some survey results. And Alexis, I'm just going to click, but let me know if I get out of sync.
Sure.
If you want to take over.
Yep, sure. So we, as of this morning, we had 460 responses. So just thank you to everybody for helping with that outreach. I mentioned in an email over this weekend that we're extending it to the end of this week. So any other outreach you can do between now and the end of this week is very much appreciated. I know, John, I was wondering, I know you had said that I think the senior center wouldn't be able to get it in their newsletter, but do you know if they put out any information about it?
I don't know. I know I dropped off some posters there.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I was been away for the last 8-9 days, but
Okay.
I'll go over tomorrow and check that.
Okay, well, thank you for doing that. I wasn't sure, in
Yeah.
what capacity they were able to do that, but thank you. And then, so other committee members had shared with me what they've done. So we really appreciate that. Any other push you can do this week is great.
Yeah.
80% live in Orleans year round, 7% of respondents live in Orleans seasonally, and 13% do not live in Orleans, which kind of made me wish we had asked a follow-up question of what is your affiliation with Orleans? Is it that you work there? What is your interest in this process? But so that is an interesting statistic. You can go to the next bullet. Okay, so 94% of resident respondents, so the only people who would be answering that were the people who indicated they live in Orleans, own their own home. And so just as a comparison to the most recent American Community Survey, approximately 20% of housing units in Orleans are renter occupied. So it appears that the renter population is underrepresented in this survey. So that's one thing to be aware of. If we can think of, over this next 5 days, how to see what we can do about that. 63% of respondents are 65 and over. And so this might be a little, which means under 65 might be underrepresented because again, looking at American Community Survey, approximately 46% of Orleans residents are 65 and older. So we don't have census data for 2020 yet on those specific. Some census data has been released, but those two data points are not available. So we have to look at ACS for those points. And then 65% of respondents have lived in Orleans for over 10 years. I put these because I thought the breakdown was interesting. So you can see in terms of the length of question 5, how long people have lived in Orleans, just that kind of range there. And then the what is your age? There's really that big bump at the 65 to 74 response. And then a question that I'm glad we asked, 22% of resident respondents indicated that they do live within a 10 to 15 minute walk of the site. Okay, so that's just kind of the general who's taken the survey so far. If you could go to the next slide. So in terms of the housing for the site, we asked, after giving kind of a framework of what housing needs were and what income levels look like and whatnot, we asked, so knowing all that, what income levels do you think this should kind of be targeted? And so, again, there's this kind of range of responses, which echoes what we heard, and this will come on a later slide, through interviews and the community meeting. But that the primary bump that people think there's a big need for is that 80 to 100% AMI. And I would say that also does echo a lot of what Elizabeth and I heard about kind of this workforce housing, as it's often called, and this kind of need for people who are priced out of typical affordable housing developments, but can't afford market. And then we also asked about the types of home, and also, whether it be the tenure as well. And this again also echoes, people have kind of a range of opinion. Most respondents indicated rental for year round. We did want to ask about the seasonal workers, because that is something that we had kind of heard anecdotally, and just kind of wondering where, if at all, this kind of fits into this framework. But, still a lot of support for some ownership as well. So, and this is just the preliminary results. It's still open. We just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what things are looking like. So Elizabeth, if you could go to the next slide. So we then asked, in terms of kind of the secondary use other than housing, what do you think is the most important? And this, we're still kind of sifting our way through these responses, but what I decided to look at for tonight is for what people select as the top priority, what were the most responses? And the top response for that additional housing, 32% of respondents indicated that was the #1 priority. Because I don't know if you've taken the survey, you can have multiple choices there, but you rank it. So housing, that was the highest in terms of #1, and then community center close behind. A community park with a connection to the rail trail, 15% said that should be the secondary use as the top priority. Municipal facilities, and then other. We haven't really gotten into those open responses yet, so I can't really speak to what those others are tonight, but so that's that. And then in terms of the for additional housing, what income levels, you see that same kind of that pattern of income level thresholds. So that's it for the survey. Elizabeth, if you want to. So for the interview findings, Elizabeth and I conducted several small group interviews with a total of 23 individuals so far. We are doing another wave of these small group interviews once we have some kind of more specifics to talk about with staff to get their input, and other housing experts and whatnot. But for now, interviews were sent out to a wide range of people. We based it on who responded. We had representation from various boards and committees, town and school staff. We had a couple of abutter small group interviews. had some representation from the business community. And then in terms of affordable housing, we interviewed from community development partnership, Habitat, and then Housing Authority. So that's who we spoke to in kind of these smaller settings. And we did that prior to the community meeting. So we would have just, to help orient us in the process. So you can go to the next slide. So, some of the things that we heard in looking over all of our notes, and these were kind of the things that we heard like a majority consensus on, but not universal. So I don't want to imply that everybody thought this. We did hear from, again, those small amount of people, 23 people, but who have, a lot of knowledge about this in your community. Housing needs are a priority, and this site provides a strong opportunity, a unique opportunity to address these needs. And the town, we heard, several people say that the town really has this great opportunity to get it right with this site in terms of creating kind of a model housing development, although the definition of what that is varies for some people who we spoke to. That meant, how many households you can provide affordable housing for, and for others it meant all the different types of housing and how much could be fit on the site. So that was interesting that we heard that multiple times, that this is a unique opportunity to get it right, but what getting it right means varies. And also there's a strong link, undeniably so, between the lack of affordable lowercase a, uppercase a housing and difficulty maintaining your local employment base. That seems, from what we heard, to be kind of worsening. And I'm sure COVID obviously exacerbated that as well. But also an area of consensus, there's a variety of need at a range of income levels. The Cape's unique housing needs that are really, because you're a tourism-based economy, it's becoming more pronounced, more undeniable. And then also, I can't say there's universal consensus about this, but we heard quite a bit that more retail is not what this site needs. There's already, empty storefronts, things like that. That's not, there was some sense that maybe there's some community or tourism draw, but not retail. Okay, so that was kind of majority consensus through the interviews. Lack of consensus, whether the site should be entirely used for housing, whether the secondary use, what the secondary use should be, if not housing. And it's interesting because this is really the same thing at the community meeting. Whether any secondary uses that aren't housing should primarily be for the benefit of those living in the development. So there are some participants really had this kind of idea of what can we create, like a nice neighborhood feel, play areas for children or parklets for people who live there. Not that closing other people out, but that it's really focused on that kind of creating a neighborhood versus creating amenities for the community at large. Also, whether the site should serve as having not the primary use of the site, but some fixture, some element of it that is also kind of a draw to for visitors to Orleans. And then again, this is so much of what we want to talk about tonight is what your criteria are, because this kind of lack of consensus with whether the priority should be the number of households with housing needs being served, which would mean greater density, most likely rental, if that should be the priority, or focusing on kind of a diversity of housing options in terms of tenure and type and income levels, knowing that that would serve fewer households. And then the appropriateness of using the site to address the need for seasonal worker housing, that we didn't hear a ton of, but that definitely came up, especially from the business community. And then what income levels have the greatest need? We did hear frequent references to firefighters, police, teachers. So again, that kind of, just out of reach of affordable housing income thresholds, but cannot get, can't afford market rate housing. So the lack of consensus on that, but we did hear that a lot. And then you can go to the next slide. So in terms of the abutter concerns, we did want to kind of talk about some of the things that just in terms of what the site would look like. So not all, we do want, this was a very, a couple of small interviews, so I don't want to seem like this is some large representation, but the concerns that we heard to keep in mind for people who live in proximity to the site, security, particularly with like pedestrian cut-throughs, concerns about that, visual privacy. So that also kind of came up with concerns about trees coming down, noise, what the lighting would look like, building height. It's just things that might feel as an intrusion. But then other abutters pointed out, well, it was a motel before. So, I mean, those things were already a factor. So that was kind of an interesting topic of conversation. Also, just in terms of like any impact on traffic, and then the look of the buildings. So I believe that's it for the interviews. And then Elizabeth, if you go to the community meeting summary, really echoed a lot of what we heard through the interviews. So meeting attendance kind of fluctuated throughout, but so some people were coming in and out of the call, but I was monitoring the breakout groups. And so there were 5 breakout groups. They ranged, sometimes some were sometimes as small as 8, sometimes up to 12 during the course of the discussions. There was majority, but not universal consensus that the site should be used to address housing needs. I would say significant majority, but we did hear, some other thoughts as well. Majority consensus that design matters and should be an important consideration for the project. Preservation of trees, topography, other environmental concerns. This was a significant concern, although it was no group identified that as like an area of consensus. It kind of came out at the end of the call after lack of consensus of the housing types, the tenure, income thresholds. But there did appear to be some common sentiment that there could be an opportunity for some variety. And then again, that lack of consensus of how much of the site should be used for housing versus other needs. So those are kind of our takeaways, what we've heard so far. Again, the survey is still open. And Elizabeth, I believe our next slide is kind of summarizing this, and then I'll ask if you have any questions. So those common values that we've heard. So there's significant support for affordable housing on the site. There's an interest in a mix of uses and a mix of incomes. There's importance for visual attractiveness in that Cape context. And then points of disagreement, disagreement on the primary use for housing as well as on secondary use. Differences of opinion on the tenure, income level, and other factors relating to the affordable housing. And then a variety of uses and building types that would complement the eclectic town center. So those are the big key takeaways from where we are right now with community engagement. I know that took a few minutes longer than I thought, but does anyone have any comments about that before we turn it back over?
That's okay. You can just absorb. You don't have to comment necessarily.
I have to say, it really doesn't surprise me from what I thought the general consensus would be beforehand.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk with you. You need to keep going.
Okay. All right.
Sure.
Thank you.
And so with all that kind of, we have that context now, kind of analyzing the site and looking at data and topography, and we've heard a little bit from the community, but we wanted to start talking about how the committee wants to evaluate options. And so Mark kind of foreshadowed this a bit. And so I believe George sent out some kind of teaser like questions of how you might consider the committee might think of how they weigh priorities. And so we put some of these in based on what we've heard, but we'd also like to know if the committee has other things you would want to be evaluating options going forward. So what we had heard was that visual attractiveness. You also might think about the number of households serves or whether that housing serves critical populations. You might have a priority for uses that benefits the public at large. And there also might be looking at it from a sense of return on investment. So those were just ideas to kind of whet your appetite, but we'd also like it to open up to conversation to talk about what different committee members think the priority should be as you evaluate options going forward.
Well, I'll just start off since no one said. I think it needed. First of all, I have a question, and that is, and this is to me, if we do something else besides housing, how much room does that take up that would then therefore not let us have the impact by building all housing on that. That's a question I think maybe some of the others there could answer. I personally am very concerned, and I know you're sick of hearing me say this, that this is going to be an attractive addition to the town, period. I will be absolutely against anything that is not. And you've all seen in town, our beautiful substation that takes over the main impact there. And so I really think that would be that. So that's all I really have. I also think landscaping is essential to make something attractive. And no matter how nice a house you build, the landscaping is going to be part of it. And I don't know if we've really addressed that. We sort of walked around it. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
Tina and Debbie both have their hands up. Debbie, you want to start? We've not heard from you in a while.
Okay. I think that I get concerned by things like greatest number of households where we start to get into a lot of objective criteria or return on investment, which again, I don't really even understand what that means. For me, my top priorities are that the attractiveness issue and that it be diverse in everything, in ages, in income levels, and in look and feel. I do not want to see, a housing development. And that goes to, your standard suburban housing development, whether it's single family houses or apartment buildings or garden apartments or anything where all of the buildings look exactly the same. And they're designed to fit in the maximum number of units. I think when we look at our village center, it's always had housing. Most of that side of the village is our houses, and there's a range of style, of size, and I think that we are creating, I believe, a neighborhood potentially, or a new version of a neighborhood, and that diversity piece is going to be, for me, absolutely essential. So that's not like a generalized criteria, except that it is a criteria. I really don't want to see a single population, a single design, a mass of buildings that just fill up the entire space. So anyway, that's a first reaction. I have other priorities, but I'll leave it there.
Tina?
So as part of the kind of diversity you're talking about almost splits into some of these umbrellas, for visual attractiveness, for example, you're talking about a diversity of building types and whatnot, and the greatest number of households served. You're more thinking the diversity of the types of households served rather than focusing on some target number.
Correct.
Is that, yeah, okay.
And I just really want to see, all ages, families, as well as retirees. I think it's very bad for everybody to live in little segregated bubbles. And this is an opportunity to make a neighborhood that serves lots of different people. Okay.
Tina?
Sure, thank you, Elizabeth. So, same thing as everybody else, or Debbie and John, it has to be attractive. So I think that's number one. And the greatest number of households served, I agree with Debbie that it shouldn't be limited to one group, for example, demographic group. So for example, people with children, people who are retired. So definitely a diversity of population served. And I also think it should be mixed income. So in other words, and I'm not going to choose the categories tonight, but it should be a range of incomes. Who would qualify to live there. I am interested in housing that serves critical populations. I think that unfortunately, from here to Naples, Florida, John, there are many more who are becoming that critical population. So I think, I know you have definitions in here, but I just think we need to really think about what that critical population is. And then the last thing, a potential for return on investment, would that be better phrased as tax neutral, revenue, expense neutral? Because there was concern in our group, the community meeting, that and I think it's well thought out, is that if we keep raising real estate taxes in Orleans, there'll be fewer and fewer people who can afford to stay here if the tax becomes a bigger burden in the cost of housing. So I just think that, and Debbie, I do know what ROIs are. I used to do them all the time, but it's not an easy concept. So, and that's it. Thank you.
I think, can I just make a comment about our return on investment? When we were talking about this, we also discussed as a way to look at this as the town sort of getting the most value for money, so to speak. They've spent money to acquire this property and do this work. If you build one housing unit, your return on that investment is relatively low. If you build 20, it's 20 times what that one housing unit is. So a conversation about that as well, I think, is in addition to the revenue side of maximizing the utility of the site so that the town is maximizing the benefit of their dollars invested.
Thank you, Brad. That helps.
Thanks, yes.
Fran, I think you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Yeah, I really like what I've heard so far. It's exactly how I feel. I think this should be, Debbie, I think used the word community. Or neighborhood. I was thinking community. This should be a community of diverse ages, diverse types of incomes, diverse design housing. And I think, yes, we want the greatest number of households served, but we want to do it not in that big box apartment style. I think we can do it with very attractive household styles that have multiple units in them. So I really like all of that. It did come up in our group regarding the return on investment, that people are concerned. And I think the public doesn't understand that when we build affordable housing, that housing pays taxes. And it's very likely that whatever we build on this site may return in taxes something greater than what was there in the past. I mean, I don't know that. It certainly depends on what we put there, but I think we should at least help people understand that whatever goes there is going to bring taxes. And I do think that that's an important factor. The other factor that I might add is what is marketable? Because we can say this is exactly what we want and we can have 100% agreement on it. But if it's not marketable, if there's not a developer that says, yes, I can do what you want and do it in a way that I can feasibly do it financially and make some profit, I think that we have to keep that in mind. What is the development community out there looking for? What are the needs generally in the development community? Because we want responses to our RFP when we come together making that.
Can I just tack on to that a little bit? I mean, I agree with you, Fran, that we want responses. We want a responsible developer. But I also feel that and I've said this before, that a lot of the way development of affordable housing has evolved over the past however many years, I'm not sure that even addresses the issues that we're trying to address. And I think we also have to be open-minded about the possibility of finding and spending money in other ways. And I'll say, for example, one thing about when you say constraints on the site, having these, the topography, and it's more expensive to build, lower levels, walk out lower levels potentially. I'm just kind of making this up. I've heard it. I wouldn't say that that means that we shouldn't do that. If that's the way we can maximize use of the space and get families in and work with the topography, then maybe we have to look at other ways of raising the money. And the whole attractiveness issue, it's always going to be a balance. Materials are very expensive right now. And basically you can't build anything, for a reasonable amount of money. Hopefully that will change at some point, but if it doesn't, we might have to come up with ways of paying more. And that goes to the populations we're talking about addressing too. The 120%, I know, like the funding streams don't support some of the populations that we want to see have an opportunity to live in Orleans. So what are we does that mean that we're just going to eliminate that group as an option altogether? Or are we going to look at other ways? And I don't know what those other ways are. I wish I did. I'd solve the problems of the whole country if I could come up with that. But I just don't want us to foreclose our thinking about some creative ways of raising money.
I absolutely agree. I wasn't meaning to preclude anything. I just think that that is a factor that we have to have in the balance.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
I think that's a great segue to kind of some of what we want to talk about for the rest of our conversation. I don't think the committee needs to decide on, how you'll weigh different options, but I think it's good to get those concepts out on the table. And just because you're kind of foreshadowing what my next slides are, I'll jump to those and we can definitely talk about those against the priorities. But let's see if I gotta clear my drawings. And so what Jeremy did, just to give folks a sense of what we mean and how many households you might serve in different ways on the site, we developed a matrix to kind of show you those different options. But before I show you those options, we wanted to give you some context for some of those realities Debbie was talking about as we begin to pull Brett in and as we begin to research, well, what kind of money is there out there to make these ideas happen? And so the reality is that the largest source of dollars to create affordable housing at the state level is the low income housing tax credit. It's oftentimes called LIHTC. And so Brett did some research on what the state has funded, because the state decides what they fund. And typical projects funded in the last few years have been between 45 and 75 units. Like the majority have been between 40 and 50, and they are one stick-built building, although townhouses are also a possibility. But as you kind of separate folks into separate buildings, the construction costs go up. The state likes to see mixed income projects, but the banks that provide tax credits, they like to see single income because it makes their risk lower, that they won't get out of compliance. And when you use low income housing tax credits, they introduced a kind of new feature to that funding that you can serve households up to 80% of AMI, but the average income across folks who live in the building has to be at or below 60% of AMI. And then, so that's kind of the largest source. And so when we look at serving folks who make 80 to 120, there is a state source to help have those folks find a place in a housing development. It's a quasi-public state agency called Mass Housing. But when you look at their application page, they say, we'll only put in $100,000 a unit. And so it's really hard to make you can't make one project go that far with that little subsidy per unit. So usually the way that money is used is to serve workforce households in a development that also has lower income households, and it's used in combination. When we
Excuse me,
start-
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Is that 100,000 a unit? So you'd have somebody else would have to put in the balance to build a house. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, or Brett, do you want to speak to kind of how that shows up?
Sure. So it is a direct capital subsidy. So it would be $100,000 allocated from mass housing per housing unit. And it's capped at 20, I think, 20 units. You can have no more than 20 units in a particular project. And most of the time we see workforce housing units peppered in 5 or 7 in a larger project as the sort of middle income slice of a mixed income project. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. The mass housing would provide the $100,000 subsidy, and the developer would have to figure out where to get the other $300,000 or $350,000 that it's going to cost to build each of those units.
Okay, and do you mean per unit? Do you mean if you had 5 attached, would that be 1 unit, or could that
No,
be
one housing unit. So one
housing unit.
one apartment, no matter what size.
Okay.
Type.
Thank you. Sorry about interrupting.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. So the low income housing tax credits, which is interesting, the average income must be below 60%. So that again would be mixed income. You'd have to have very low and low to get that average to 60% for the number of units that you would serve at 80%.
That's correct.
You know, kind of the law of averages, if you will. Is that correct?
It generally works out to your majority are going to be at between 50 and 60% of AMI in any LIHTC project anyway. You're going to kind of want to maximize that sort of band. And then if you've got a handful at up to 80%, you basically offset those. It's not quite 1 for 1, but it's pretty darn close with between 30 and 50% of AMI. So you're on either end of the sort of seesaw, and you just need to balance it out at 60% throughout the entire project.
Sure. And I guess my point is that, you know, what I've heard through the survey, well, not so much through the survey, but through the community meeting, is that people really want mixed income. So I do have my chart in front of me. So if you took extremely low, then you could have more of the 80% if you did enough extremely and very low. So that's the 30 to 50%.
Yes.
I mean, we could achieve that balance.
Theoretically, yes.
Okay, thank you.
What I will say is when we get into, there is a management and a compliance consideration when you're creating housing across a large spectrum of incomes. And it can be a burden on smaller projects. It's not a big problem in 300 unit, developments. You've got enough staff, you've got enough physical space, you've got enough capacity throughout the organization to manage compliance and regulatory stuff. On smaller projects, it can be a burden. Very simple example, someone at 80% of AMI has a very different need for housing, perhaps, than someone who is at 10% of AMI. It's a different world entirely. Those populations under 30% tend to have much higher needs for social services. They have needs for job training and all sorts of the whole suite of social services that goes with a very low income population and a very low income housing development. So there are those considerations to think about as we're kind of getting towards a clearer indication of what makes sense for the site. Like nothing prohibitive. Just say these are all things that that are influence the project's feasibility one way or the other.
Thank you, Brad.
Sure.
And then I'll just run through a few of the other considerations to keep in mind, and then we'll actually get to the scenario matrix I keep talking about. We also, as you saw in the survey, there's also support for ownership. There was a little bit less in the survey than for rental, but still very, very high interest in providing ownership units on this site. The reality is there's not a lot of money at the state level to help make that happen. So a lot of times if a community is wanting to do ownership, it comes through in the form of local dollars, and that the local community has to invest funds through their Community Preservation Act committee or source of funding, or through their Affordable Housing Trust. And so for context, I asked George earlier this week, how much money does Orleans' Affordable Housing Trust have, this year? And George, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said $1.2 million.
That's what they have on hand today.
Yeah. And so, when you start to talk about projects that might be $400,000 to $500,000 a unit, just really rough off back of the envelope, it doesn't serve that many households to, like, for those local dollars alone to work in a project. And then also when you are doing affordable home ownership, the prices have to be low enough to make the case that somebody would buy into that house, because when they sell that house, the restriction will say it's got to go to another family who needs an affordable unit. So you can't sell it for what the guy from Florida bought his mansion on Nauset Harbor sold it for. It has to stay affordable, so people don't take huge amounts of equity away. And so that's just some context for how affordable homeownership might work. Habitat Cape Cod does work on the Cape and does do affordable homeownership. So I have an asterisk kind of next to that note, because we want to talk to them a little bit more about how they structure their projects. Our understanding is that typically habitats in Eastern Massachusetts work at a small scale from 2 to 6 units. And so we want to talk to them about kind of what subsidies they use typically and what kind of project might be feasible as part of this site. So we have that context. And then we also talked with Brett about dormitories. So seasonal workers wouldn't qualify in a tax credit project. They wouldn't be able to rent those units because of all the federal regulations. On Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, there are some kind of dormitory style housing, but usually the case when that happens is that it's the employer who bought the land and built and maintains the housing. It's something that the owner of the dormitory operates and owns. So that's just some context for, what other areas, how people see that play out in other areas. And Debbie, you have your hand raised.
I just wanted, maybe George, could you speak to the survey that we just did via the planning board, asking local businesses about dormitories? Maybe I'm sure have more detail than I might have.
Yeah, Debbie, for everybody, we did a seasonal housing need study, and we sent it out to the chamber and various other places. We got it on the town website, and asked others to fill it out. We did not get a resounding response. I think we got like 65 responses, and there was very little interest on the part of the businesses to partner up or participate in dormitory housing. So the takeaway, Debbie, you can add to this, the takeaway from the planning board in general was that absent a clamoring call to produce seasonal housing, dormitory style or otherwise, the planning board did not feel like they were being called to take it up based on the input they got.
Right.
So, fair enough.
I just wanted to raise that because it's come up a few times in other people's comments. And if we could go back to criteria, for me, one of the criteria will be that it's about year-round people who are going to live in this community and make it their homes. And given that even if dormitories were desirable, they could go other places. And in fact, it doesn't appear that there's a huge interest in dormitories right now.
Thanks for that context, Debbie. I think that's really helpful. And kind of got to have someone come into the table for that to work out. And you guys have done the research.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I just say that sort of meshes with what federal and state housing policy is. These programs are designed for permanent,
Right.
year-round affordable housing residents. There's no real carve out for seasonal or any other sort of things like that. While I've interrupted, George, that money that the Affordable Housing Trust has, presumably this is not the only project they are potentially being asked for funds for in the not too distant future. Is that right to assume?
Those are unencumbered funds. The trust has a certain carrying cost because they get clerical support, and they want to make sure that their housing needs study is up to date because it's 5 or 6 years out of date now. But they're not obligated to any other projects with that funding at this time. The Penrose project, which you guys are aware of, is already funded through the town. The 107 Main Street, they're seeking CPC funds, so those wouldn't directly affect the housing trust money. So
Okay.
so that's available funds.
Okay, great.
And if you don't find a way to spend it, I'm sure they will.
Yeah, the 107 project was what I was wondering, because I saw one of their presentations. They had a AHT CPC and it wasn't clear. So that's great.
Katie, looks like you have some insights to tell us about.
Yeah, nothing major. And again, I apologize for the late arrival. Just to speak to the trust piece. No, they're absolutely unencumbered, as George said. I would just say that there's hesitation from me being one of them, depleting all of those funds for one particular project. The idea of the trust is to have the opportunity to take up opportunities when they're presented. So I, for one, I can't speak for the entire trust, but I, for one, as a trust member, I'm always cautious of spending all the funds on one project and sort of leaving us with no opportunity to seek other things when they come up. So just my 2 cents.
Thanks for that context. So I will, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is kind of our long-awaited matrix. So Jeremy helped put this together. And so this matrix, so if you look on the left column is organized from top to bottom, from not very much community space to mostly community space. That's top to bottom. And then from the left to the right, sort of, is kind of the density of the housing type. So you'll see cottages, townhouses, apartments, and then I added a column for what if you split the housing types, kind of what would that look like? And so this is just to start getting familiar with how many units are we talking about, and kind of how would the funds work across a certain number of units. And then we have another version where we highlighted sort of how low-income housing tax credits typically want to fund a project. So what you'll see in blue here is that, you know, as we talked about before, when Brett did the research, typically, you know, projects the state wants to fund are low cost of construction, which tends to be apartments, and they're usually around 50 units. But, you know, sometimes those projects show up with different housing forms. Brett, is there anything you would add to kind of how we map, you know, the funds that are available onto this matrix?
Yeah, I would say that it doesn't really necessarily dictate the massing, but rather the ultimate site density. Most of the time, low-income housing tax credits are awarded for the most part to a number of different projects. Some of them are recapitalization of old projects, some of them are rehab, some of them are new construction, some of them have historic tax credit components, but the ones that are new construction, pure new builds, really fit in that 40 to 65 unit sweet spot, where you've got economies of scale that you can build a decent number of units that make it worthwhile for somebody to go through the tax credit process, which is quite costly. You can actually amortize some of those costs across a large development, but those can be in, it's not uncommon for us to see, you know, a larger project with smaller building footprints. So a 24 unit building, you know, carbon copied across the site. to get up to that 48 or that however many units, 20 to 25 units a building. And I would just say that, we're talking about feasibility earlier and who's going to want to be interested in developing this and making, sure we're being conscious of those sorts of things. Is that I think the cost constraint limit in the current QAP is something like $315,000. Is that right, Elizabeth, per unit?
I think so. And just so folks know, or the QAP is it's the qualified allocation plan. And so that's what every state agency across the country, they have to put out. It's sort of like their point system for how they're going to decide what to fund. And so the state puts regulations in that for, as the state, they're trying to spread resources as far as they can. So they'll say, if you're in Boston, you can only spend a certain amount per unit. But in the Orleans context, I believe it was, you'd only spend $315,000 per unit in construction costs. Right? Is that right, Brett?
Yes. That's guidance, and what I told Elizabeth earlier was, 2 projects that I know of that just went in for applications were over 500,000 a unit, and so construction costs are really high, and so hopefully, like we've said earlier, that'll solve itself in the not too distant future, but we're still up against very high construction costs. So the more exotic you get away from a traditional, stick-built 3-story, fairly dense building envelope or building form, the harder it is to pencil out on a financing basis. If you're starting to detach buildings and provide townhouses or cottages or things, you just get further along to a place that is harder to finance in traditional ways. Not impossible. It happens all the time. It just makes it slightly more difficult. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thanks, Brett. Katie?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this chart properly. And I'm hearing, I heard you say that, the sweet spot for the LIHTCs are, 40 to 60. And I'm seeing this no to little community space with mostly apartments at 70. Are we saying that's a combination of LIHTC, or are you saying that that's mostly LIHTC to sort of get in that sweet spot, or are we saying that there's a combination would make up the 70? I just want to try to clarify what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I'll weigh in and just say that's to be determined. So the reality is there's a number of variables at play. We knew there was how much community space, how much housing. In the housing, it was what type of housing, what density of housing, but also what tenure of housing. We haven't even layered in what are the units we're talking about. Are these all studio apartments, or are some of them 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, right? So there's just so many variables at play right now. We were trying to start to simplify it a little bit. When we first created this chart, we hadn't even necessarily gotten into the, what is a critical mass or a reasonable number of LIHTC units to be considering. But that's where, as we began to layer it in, we began to sort of notice these blue areas are what would be sort of the most feasible from a LIHTC perspective. That 70 could be entirely LIHTC, or maybe it is some kind of creative combination of LIHTC units and other units. And what we mean by other is to be determined too. That could be market rate for sale units. Maybe there's 10 units out here for sale. They're going to sell at a much higher price point than what the other ones would be going for. But we were just trying to figure out how to start wrangling these things in a little bit to give you guys an understanding. And I think a lot of this speaks to why we led with sort of what are those fees, what are those criteria that you guys are going to judge this against, right? Because as you can see, there's going to start being some trade-offs here. A desire for a mix of incomes might run a little bit counter to what the feasibility from a financial standpoint is. Or I can't think of anything more visually attractive than the lower left-hand corner, where I've got a big new community center on a big park with 16 cottages lining the edge of it, right? But that might not be the thing that's delivering sort of the highest and best use in terms of trying to get to some affordable housing, some critical mass, and delivering a feasible project. So I know that's more of an answer than question you've asked.
No, it's helpful. And I guess my question is, if we do layer in market rate and the ability to have more income coming into the property, I guess I'm just trying to grasp how these numbers can change in it, but what I'm hearing you saying is there's just too much variable to really pinpoint or even ballpark what that is. And so that's helpful. So thank you.
Or that's part of what we're trying to get through in this process, right? We're
Right.
at, step 2. And so part of what we're trying to get our heads around is when we start putting pen to paper, what are the couple of scenarios that we're really looking at? Because we can't study, 30 variations on this thing. And so our real hope was, and in some ways that maybe we shouldn't even put the blue up there. We're starting to see where we feel like we're starting to kind of settle in, but we still definitely want to get your all's input, because like some of you said, maybe this is an opportunity to dream a little bit of outside of what is normally considered, business as usual. And if we're going to do that, what are the trade-offs of that, or what do we need to be prepared to do to make that happen?
Oh, great. Thank you. I mean, it sounds like you're thinking about it the same way. At least I am. I can't speak for the rest of the committee, but I appreciate you trying to put some parameters on it. I think that's what we're looking for.
Can I ask just a question, a real quick question, please?
course.
When community space, what's your assumption of square footage for large and small community space?
I will say that,
Go ahead, Jeremy. I was going to say what you said.
Well, what I was going to say is that basically what we did to generate this matrix that you see at the top, we put in big tall caps back of envelope estimates.
Yeah.
So when we talked about no little community space, that was like no acreage on the site. When we said some community space, we said, what if like 1.5 of the 5.5 acres were communal uses? And then the mostly community space, we were saying, what if that was like 3 of the 5.5 acres? And what that meant was the remaining acreage went towards the residential. And for the residential, we just threw some, I think for the cottages, we said, think of it as like 8 units to the acre, up to the mostly apartments was 14 units to the acre. So again, we were just trying to get some numbers on the page, but that doesn't mean, if you were to focus in there, we didn't really figure out how many square feet a community center would be on that acreage per se.
Okay.
Fran?
I wanted to follow up a little bit. We don't really know whether people who are studying the community center, for example, would want to have a community center on our site, nor the library. There's been another conversation and planning group doing library feasibility. So I think it might make sense for us to have some sort of communication, mutual meeting or something with some of these other groups that are doing their own planning to see if this site is included in their list of wishes.
Frank, can I just speak to that for a minute? Having the pleasure of attending all consultant meetings this winter, I do kind of hear what gets said. The community center task force is charged to do a programmatic evaluation of what Orleans needs that would lead to a space needs and a land need for a community center. They are specifically not charged at looking at any sites. And believe me, every single meeting, they want to talk about specific sites. This seems like kind of a nice attempt to consider what might be a reasonable carve out if you wanted to set aside, if this committee wanted to recommend setting aside any land at all for community center kind of activity or some other cultural civic benefit use. So I as much as I love the cross-pollination of the economic development group with community center with Governor Prence, there's kind of a cadence to the way they're all working. And I don't think the community center is going to be able to inform you very much as to whether you should set aside land on this site. I think you can hear from them, but I think you'll have to make that decision whether you think it's appropriate without the benefit of their long-term recommendation.
May I follow up then? I see that as a problem because we need to make our plans. And if the community center group is in that level of feasibility, then it will be another level before they do the analysis of where is the ideal place in town for what they are planning. And likewise with the library feasibility, they know that they need more space. But in the presentation to the Board of Selectmen on Wednesday, they expressed a wish to keep it in the same area. So we can have difficulty making plans for moving forward in whatever we plan to do if we don't have some idea of the timing and the wishes of other people. And that means that our plans get delayed, and it takes so long to do these things anyway, and the housing needs are so desperate that it really presents a conundrum, I think.
And that might be where one of the decisions is that there are no obvious candidates at this stage for a community use. And either let's go forward then with it being primarily a housing project, or let us determine that there is some amount of space we would like to set aside, not knowing exactly what it might end up being. Obviously, that gets a little bit tricky. You'd like to know what it is because that might inform certain geometries, et cetera, of how you deploy that. It could be that the community space is just a park, it's open space, or structures that are not big programmed, expensive public building kind of structures, but there's still a feeling that will there be members of the community that are upset that all 5.5 acres got developed as housing, that there was no portion of it set aside and kept as something that the public at large would be able to come utilize. So it might also be that we don't have to have sort of the specific answer, but we have to have a really good sort of direction or approach that we're considering, understanding that we might even decide, so we decide it's an acre. And that the unfortunate thing is 3 years from now, the community center group comes out and says, we figured out the perfect amount is 2 acres. And you suddenly realize like, oh, that's a bummer. Like if we'd only known, right? But we can only do what we can do. So I would guess I would just say there are varying levels of decision-making that can be had, understanding that you're either leaving certain flexibilities in place or taking certain things out. But you can see why this is a complicated challenge for us, right? This is why we're trying to sort of bracket this conversation, because we need to know where to kind of get started and see where it goes.
So it's not only how much space to set aside, it's which space to set aside. And if we're going to do housing in part of it, we need to know what part, because what we plan for housing will vary on where on the site it goes, partly because of the topology.
That's right. So if you do, when I was out on the site, one thing I noticed is obviously 6A is it's not a terribly busy road, but it's certainly a commercial, you've got a Christmas tree shop across the street. One of the things we talked about is, would you want housing all the way up to 6A, using the whole site for housing? Or is there a scenario where you might say, I don't think we want to do housing all the way up to 6A. Let's pull back and leave some frontage. Maybe that frontage would be more appropriate for some sort of communal use. So, another tack would be to say, if we knew the community use was just going to be open space, well, maybe we do open space on some of the really steeply sloped portions of the site and put the housing more where it's a little bit flatter to help reduce that cost a little bit. So again, there's a couple of different ways that could play out depending on what you were deciding.
Yeah. Thank you.
Listen, excuse me, I don't know how to show my hand or.
I see your hand, John, you're waving.
Okay. Am I correct that on the survey that the library has not been mentioned at all or was insignificant?
Sure. So there was a municipal uses question, which was, let's see, that was back a few slides. So it was in like the top 5, but then there was an other, I'm sorry, for them to specify which municipal uses, and we don't have those open responses pulled yet. So some people may have said library, some may have said fire, some, we're not sure yet, but we'll have that. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So that 10% there, we'll see what those responses are.
Okay, but it's nowhere, the community center, which showed up near the top.
Yeah, yes.
Library.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, they're talking about wanting to be in the same place they are now, or hoping to be, but okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, did you
Yeah,
have your hand up for a
I
new hand?
I did because I think, we just brought up a really important point in terms of looking at the site. Like in my imagination, that front edge, which is a total of, I think you said 450 feet of frontage on 6A. Obviously, you wouldn't take up the whole thing, but it's not only, I don't see where you want housing right along there. We want to create our walkable, pedestrian-friendly, active street edge. And on the first floor of a building, you could do at least a 3-story building right there, that on one floor could be flexible community space of similar square footage to, say, the Cultural Center of Cape Cod, which is only 9,000 square feet, although they've added to it. So we'll say that's a total of 18,000 square feet. You could include an activity space that would serve the whole community as well as the residents who live on that site, with a restaurant, with a kitchen, with meals being served potentially to seniors. And then you would still have 2 floors above that could be apartments. And that's just, one idea. I just don't see why. I don't want to eliminate the potential for a community space. It doesn't have to be a giant building that sits in the middle. There are other ways maybe of imagining what it could be that could still accommodate lots more housing than we currently have. And when you talk about return on investment, another thing this town does not have is a large enough community gathering space for just that, community gathering. We just don't have it. There's always been a concept of looking at the town like a college campus and going from smaller space to smaller space, and that's still absolutely part of the potential. When you've got the library in one spot, you've got the old firehouse small space in another spot, but the senior center off where it is, but you still do not have that cultural center that I guess the question is who would program it, and that's where it's nebulous, because there'd have to be a group formed that would take that piece on and run it, and that doesn't
One
exist.
quick thing, I think Elizabeth wants to move on. Elizabeth, would it be helpful for you, and this is also a question to the committee, if we ask somebody from the Cultural Center Committee to come and talk to us soon and explain that we need to have some sort of, it would be helpful to have some sort of indication of their interest soon to move ahead?
Yeah, I think that might be John and or Alexis. I mean, I think we were talking about reaching out to Habitat to get some more context, and this is another kind of similar way to get more information about feasibility and interest about this particular site. So I think we could interview the folks from the Cultural Center, just kind of see where they're at looking for additional space and how that might fit in.
It's the community.
You mean the community center task force?
The community
Yeah.
center.
I thought Debbie had said the Cultural Center, but I mean, the
There is
community.
no cultural center.
Oh, all right. Well, I meant the community center, but yeah.
Debbie, I think what you just described, I mean, there's a lot of, I love the idea of lining that edge with what you would have found there historically and what you still find there on either side of it, right? Are these structures that have a ground floor that's available for some use other than housing and housing upstairs, and the degree to which you program those first floor spaces as communal uses or retail uses, maybe when there's more demand in some future date, as co-working spaces. We haven't talked about sort of office uses, but a lot of communities are considering those sorts of things. I think the trick is just understanding that those things probably don't mix well with low-income housing tax credits, but maybe that's where you think of the front edge as being something you're looking for, more of a market rate partner that would build market rate units above and have the flexibility of renting out those ground floor spaces, even as community uses, with a tax credit project sort of behind it, in that it adheres to all of the sort of things those need to be. So, as we're trying to get to these sort of, what are the 3 scenarios we start to play with at the beginning, I think that is a really creative way of thinking of one of the three and having that mix of some of the things. And it's really in response to an edge that we have to address, and we have to think about the 6A frontage, right? So that's where the realities of the site start to sort of circle in and start to suggest various approaches. But I think there's something really interesting about that idea.
Yeah, and so that's another kind of timely segue, because I think what we wanted to close out this meeting talking about was Jeremy's next meeting with the community, which is the design thinking event. And so Jeremy, I know you were, well, here, let me get rid of my drawings and then I'll get to that slide where we had it outlined, sort of what we were thinking about. Okay, gotta stop drawing. And then if my computer will just let me click. Okay. So what we had been thinking about for April 11th. So obviously we'll need your help again, reaching out to different channels and different communities of people so that they know about this meeting. My colleague Alexis will have some template text that you can use to do that outreach and an image. But the structure of what we were thinking about for that meeting was having a presentation that kind of went through a lot of the things that we walked the committee through today. But then having small group discussion to discuss people's preferences for, you know, what they'd like to see on the site. And Jeremy, do you have thoughts on, Jeremy wanted to get all your opinions, going to see how the conversation was. Jeremy, do you have thoughts on what you'd want the content of that small group discussion to focus on?
Yeah, I'm thinking that focuses less on development scenarios, because we could go every which way with that. And, you know, I think that's really on this committee to help guide us in terms of what those scenarios are that we would start developing. I think what's more useful for that portion of with the larger group is to focus on sort of form and character through a little bit of a visual preference scenario. And so we could show images that show, you know, more smaller buildings or fewer larger buildings, and, you know, have those come up and have a group discussion around what does the group think is preferential, or something that's a little more traditional and something that's a little more contemporary. We'll think about what are those couple of things that really will inform form and character with the group. But again, I think we really wanted, before we got to that, it was really, you can see the first bunch of bullets here really, I think, are about sort of bringing the community along in terms of what we've been hearing, what we've heard so far, where it seems to be going and why it's going that way, like helping the larger community understand the challenges of the realities of low-income housing tax credits, not in such detail that we have them all glaze over and lose them, but just to understand that there are these real, you know, criteria that we need to consider when we're doing this. You can't just be sort of a anything we dream up sort of scenario. But again, coming back to the end then to getting their feedback, you know, we don't want to just present at them for the whole session. We want to sort of bring them along as to how things are going and where we think we're going and what we think is going to be really playing into it. But we want their input on sort of things like form and character that will really inform us as to what, you know, when you're rating, is it visually attractive? In some ways, what this is what do we think is visually attractive as we start to consider that. And then as she's starting to show on here too, that we could do a small group discussion on a couple of those visual preference points, come back together to discuss those as a larger group at the very end. But then we would follow that meeting with a survey that is additional visual preference, and also then to get that same sort of input from a much broader audience, since we tend to have obviously fewer people come to these public presentations versus the sort of reach we can get when we put out a survey.
So this would be a little more a visual thing rather than a factual thing.
I think it starts factual and ends visual.
Yeah, I think people would be, I think visual, to say that that's going to happen would be attractive to potential attendees. Put it that way.
Yeah.
John, I got to participate in some of this that was done by Union Studios when they did a Cape-wide look at scenario planning for the missing middle. Yeah. And Jeremy, I think you had, I don't know, 50 different, you know, do you like this better than this options? A couple of those might be, that kind of thing works really well. And people they see the nuance of the design that they're selecting, and it works well. And Jeremy, if you feel like you want to start by explaining the outcome of that scenario you did a couple of years ago for the Governor Prence property and what you liked about the site, that a lot of people saw the visual on that, the graphic from above, and they really they got a feel for how density can be accommodated in smaller scale. So I thought that came out really well.
Yeah, we could certainly share that as part of that for sure. And I think the only reason we're even bringing up the factual is we know that we need to bring the public along through this whole thing. And we don't want to get to the end and present something and have everybody go, wait, I thought we all said we were doing a big community center here, right? That we're sort of helping them understand how we're trying to understand this and bring it along and make some critical points. But again, we've got 2 weeks between now and then, and we'll certainly be reviewing that with George to make sure we're not, again, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of high tech financing with the general public, but they do need to understand that there are critical criteria that are the only way to get these things funded. And so we have to keep that in mind. And that's sort of the level that we would talk about it with them.
Great.
Whoops.
Debbie had her hand up.
I tried. It went away. Jeremy, and this is a tricky thing, I know, and maybe using some of what you've done already would be the way to go, but I'm on the architectural review committee, and I work in an architect's firm, and I know how hard it is for people to imagine what is being described when it comes to design and forms of buildings and how they lay out and how they relate to each other. And while this is where it's tricky and I don't have the answer, you don't want to present something that's, like it's a done deal. But if there could be examples, even in other places, but not places that not urban centers, because nobody's going to want that. But that would be appropriate to, a small town on the Cape that could just show concepts of how different scenarios could lay out, even with, just blocks of color and size maybe, and them getting into the style preferences. I participated in that workshop you did a while back. I think that would be very helpful rather than leaving things more open-ended and descriptive, because most people don't have buildings in their heads.
Right.
or they latch on to something they saw once that they really hated, and that's what they're imagining, and that's doesn't have to be what we're talking about at all.
You make an excellent point. I do know that that's even with the effort we did with the Cape Cod Commission, even drawing site plans, we were like, people don't understand what is implied in a site plan. So what really was important was doing the little 3-dimensional renderings where you really could start to see the footprints of the buildings, and oh, that's how big that space is, and oh, that's what you're showing by that building. So I do know for our next session with the public will be more in that realm.
Right.
So again, I think at this point it's still helping us understand. I mean, even with you guys, right? We haven't drawn any plans up and started showing things to you guys and getting your input.
Right.
So you guys should always be sort of 2 steps ahead. We're sort of helping them come along, but at points where it's still important to get the feedback. Like we are legitimately looking for their input relative to the form and the character of this thing. Because if everybody freaks out every time we show a building that even has only 4 units in it, we got to really think hard about how we're going to talk about this with the community. Either that's, sorry guys, but we got to do it, or this group will decide, no, it seems like the community really only wants us to do 30 units out here. And let's figure out how to do the best 30-unit project we can on this site, or else, we've completely ignored the feedback we've been getting. So
I know we're getting to the end, Elizabeth. I see Mark's hand up, and then I'll let you try and wrap it up.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, I'm wondering, George, if there's some way we could talk to you and you could talk to the group about some relief from zoning restrictions. As an example, I think you look at parking, that if you have a residential unit in a complex, you have to have 2 spaces per unit. So when we start looking at the number of units that we potentially could build at the Governor Prence site, or we look at a mix of some community space with units. Parking can carve up a lot of that acreage, and I think almost unnecessarily. I'm wondering if there's some way we can get relief from that and say that what we're trying to encourage here is a walkable downtown Orleans. And so creating living space for people that can walk to parks, to the supermarket, to downtown, to the water, to the library or whatever. They don't need 2 parking spaces per unit. Can we circumvent some of those zoning restrictions and help us better utilize the site?
Yeah, Mark, that's a good point, and a lot of the zoning adopted in 2017 has that baked in. So I'll go over that with these guys, with the consultant in detail a little more in our offline meeting, and we can figure out how we want to present that in some summary fashion, because there's a lot of flexibility available. I want to make sure you guys understand it, so whatever gets said in public is understood. Thanks.
Especially since, George, I'm assuming you would like for us to try to come up with schemes that work within the existing zoning. Right?
Why not? We're at 77 units, potential total per acre. I don't think we need to exceed that.
Yeah, well, there's any number of other criteria that, I ask because of my probably 20 years of experience, I don't know that I've ever done a by right project. Because at the end of the day, to do the best project, you usually end up doing a few things. Zoning's in place to keep the worst of projects from happening, but it doesn't necessarily deliver the best of projects. And it could be something that we just understand as we go through this thing. But like the way building height is defined sometimes can be really painful to work your way through and understand. And then you suddenly realize, if I just had 2 more feet, like if I only had 2 more feet. So I've never worked on a project where I don't ask for, a waiver request on height or parking or sometimes setbacks or something, any number of things. But again, let's keep talking it through. I'm glad Mark brought it up.
Yeah, there's a few local quirks you should be aware of.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I think I think we got through everything that I was hoping to cover. I think you folks got a little preview of what we'll cover with the community, and then we'd be adding on that kind of visual preference context, and then putting out a survey so that more than just the folks in the room can have their input on what the visual preferences are in town. And we'll be sending out text to help promote that meeting to your networks. And then we also have a little bit more work on our end to reach out to those folks we were talking about and to begin to do our work with Brett about looking at housing needs and site suitability and some of those kind of more financing questions that we'll be doing on the back end as Jeremy starts to get started on design. So, John, I think we're pretty close to 7, so that's exciting.
Good. Now, am I correct that you will be sending out emails to people who you've gathered their email addresses from the previous to notify them about the 11th?
That's a good question. So we have email addresses from the people at the interviews and other outreach that we compiled with George. Unfortunately, the Zoom did not capture the email addresses. When we downloaded the poll results, the email column was all empty. Yeah. So we don't know what happened with that. So I have the names of the poll people. So what I may do is see with George, if any of those names are, first of all, not everybody wanted email correspondence.
Send me a list of the names. I'll tell you which ones I have email addresses for.
Okay. And then I can actually share them with the committee too, to see if anyone has any other email addresses to fill in.
Because that'd be very helpful to let them know what.
Yeah.
This is the follow up to
Absolutely.
the next meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
I think
And
it's
all of the,
important.
the special interviews that we did and whatnot, we will be following up with them as well. So,
Okay. I think the PR in town is important before, the next week or so to get that out. Okay.
yes, absolutely.
And can
Now,
we
just Fran, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can we just be reminded of the survey will be open until what? Because I'm thinking of sending out a bunch of emails inviting people to the April 11th meeting, but I would also want to say, if you haven't filled out the survey, you can do so until ... What's the closing date?
Friday, April 1st. So I'm going to send out tomorrow the suggested language for the community meeting and a visual. And I think that's a great idea. If you can, as long as you can send it out before Friday, April 1st, anybody else, to remind people front and center in that text as well to take the survey.
Okay.
Okay, Elizabeth, are you finished then? We got a couple other brief things in the meeting and
We're all set.
great. Thank you guys also, all of you, very nice. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Move
Alrighty.
adjournment.
Wait, no.
Wait a sec.
Hold on. We need to approve the minutes of the last
we'll
meeting
see
of
you guys.
February 14th.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Second, all in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Okay. And also, George, you had mentioned, or we received notice that we have a scheduled meeting of May 9th, which was going to conflict with the town meeting.
Right.
And we had talked about whether we need it. I would suggest that we maybe, if we are going to say anything at the town meeting, that it might be helpful for us to get together on the 2nd. George, what's your thought there on, are we going to be asked to say something, what's going on at the town meeting?
I don't think your study will be done until August. So
I don't think it is, but I don't want to, okay. The answer is no then.
you know, sometimes there's a place under Article 1 for boards and committees to give any reports they wish to give. If you wanted to give an interim to say we are still welcoming public input, you know, let's just play that by ear.
Okay, all right. So should we have one on the 2nd or just wait, postpone it from the 9th? Just,
If members can make it, you don't want to skip a meeting. You got a lot of discussion to occur.
yeah, okay. Well, then I will suggest that we schedule for the 2nd and everybody who can make it can, and is that all right with you, George?
I will inform the town clerk's office and the TV channel, make sure we can get that in for that time.
Okay. Great.
So we're talking the 2nd and then still the 23rd for
And
May.
still the 23rd, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you on the 11th.
Motion to adjourn?
Oh, yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Second.
Fran will second it. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.